This episode is brought to you by Amica's Bistro.
Hola a todos.
Meredith.
Sí.
What are you doing?
I'm translating.
Okay. On Wednesdays, try the assorted taco platter.
Cada miércoles, ¿qué tal los tacos sortidos? Delicioso.
Are you sure that you're translating this properly?
Absolutamente.
On Wednesdays, come, listen to the music and join the band.
Cada miércoles ven a escuchar la música, cantar o tocar su instrumento favorito.
That does not sound like what I said.
¿Mande?
Amiga's Bistro, a taste of Mexico in the heart of Simcoe.
Amigas Bistro, en el corazón de Simcoe y pronto en el de usted.
Do you actually speak Spanish?
¿Puedes hablar español?
Meredith.
Meredith.
All right, that's it.
Es todo.
Okay, we're done.
Estamos finito.
From RFM Studios, this is Radio Free Norfolk. I'm John Harris. Good evening, everybody. The election is just 5 days away, and there's one last interview that we're going to be doing. That's Adrienne Roberts from the NDP. Now, you'll notice a slight little difference in the format here. We're right in the middle of retooling the show, so we're going to change kind of how we laid out the show. This kind of fell right in the middle of that change, so you won't hear the regular introduction, but we're going to drop you right into the interview. In the next few episodes, you'll notice that there's going to be a big format change, and we'll leave that as a surprise for when those shows come online. So we really hope you enjoy this interview. So where'd you come from? What's your story?
So my story is I am first generation Canadian. My parents moved from England to Canada. They came at 19 and 21. They came from very working class. My father's father, my grandfather, I never met him. He was a 6-year-old child miner in Wales. So very, very working class. My mom's family, my grandmother, she worked as a lunch lady essentially. And my grandfather from my mother's side, he was on the rails doing putting coal in the trains and stuff like that. So very working class. And my mom made a very split decision that she decided she was going to emigrate. So they came. And that, I think, is a big part of my fabric of who I am because I grew up with all those stories. And my dad decided to follow her and they came. They had no family, no nothing. They arrived on Victoria Weekend in 1966. And had nothing, 19 and 21. And that's where they started. And they, in England, they decided when they emigrated, they said Hamilton would be best because my parents are from Northern England in Middlesbrough. And they felt it was most similar. So they flew in. They had 6 weeks because there was a strike going on. So 6 weeks from start to finish. And they were suddenly in Canada. And I always remember the story. My dad got finally a job when they had $20 left. And that's how they started. Eventually, they were able to buy property and bought a house. They always wanted land. So they bought in rural Ancaster, a couple acres. And so I was raised there. And so I had this I truly had this idyllic childhood. Literally kicked out every day, go play with the animals, go play outside. I had a lot of chores. Because we did have the goats and we had chickens and we had some ducks at times and rabbits at times, depending on whatever we were doing. So definitely a busy childhood, but a very healthy childhood, very supportive parents. And I am an only child. So I had a lot of attention and a lot of support. Definitely not, I don't ever think of myself as spoiled, but definitely I'm very lucky and grateful for everything they gave to me.
So what was his first job?
He ended up, my dad's an electrician. So his first job, he had a couple places. I think he ended up I'm not sure if that was DeFasco. And my mom ended up working, she came out of England. In England at the time, they were really very well trained telephone operators. So she came out of that system and ended up, she was trying to get in here at Bell, and they actually told her she was too well trained. But she ended up doing all sorts of different things. And they just, my parents are very, and I think they led the example of try this and explore this. So over the years, they ended up somehow, and it's definitely not in their background, they ended up getting into dog shows and breeding miniature poodles. And my parents weren't raised with goats, but we had goats. And there's my mom teaching me how to milk goats. And, so I think they inspired in me that just go for it and try it. Right. And then what we did is that we would work really hard. We'd sell gladiolas at the side of the road as a family, or we'd do this or that. And everything extra we made, we didn't put it into furnishings. My parents really believed they wanted me to have a worldly education. So they were quite unique. They would pull me out of school for 3-4 weeks at a time when we could, and we travel the world. So they instilled in me this love of travel. And I have so many vivid memories of just seeing the world, just different places. And we'd go back to England. And while we were in England for a couple of weeks, let's go to Morocco for 2 weeks. So they really instilled in me this global concept. And I always think of myself as, while I'm Canadian, I'm a global citizen. And I think that impacts how I see the world and see people, and that we're human. I had this I had this idyllic childhood. I was very, very fortunate. We worked, definitely everything we did, we worked for as a family, but I always had support and love. So, and the ability to say, let's try something. They'd go into something like, suddenly they discovered karaoke. We were in Florida for a couple of weeks. And so they bought a karaoke machine, and they did that in the evenings. And, my dad's working, my mom's working, and then my mom would be grooming poodles on the side here, typical woman in the sense of so many of us. Doing these small businesses that work around family life. And then at the same time, she was involved in home and school. She ran for trustee when I was a kid. So just very inclusive and active people. So when you ask about where do I come from, it's not a place. It's more I think the life I had as a child has definitely had an impact. So when I told Mom that I was going to do this, she's like, good for you. And she's like, what? And they were so proud, and they've been ardent supporters since the day I told them. And they're like, go for it. We believe in you. You can do it. And that's who they are. So very lucky. And I can't say enough great things about that life I've had.
So you're a teacher.
Yes.
So when did you know that you were when did you first get the inkling that you were going to go into teaching?
I went into teaching later in life, actually. I always love education. I love to learn. Like, I need to learn. I don't do well without intellectual stimulation. So I always wanted to go to McMaster. Went to McMaster, and I wanted to do archaeology. So I studied archaeology and history, did my minor in English. And then I went to Newfoundland, and I was working on my master's out there doing archaeology. And I worked in a national site called Fairyland, which is an amazing archaeological site. I lived there for 3 years. But halfway through the program, what I noticed was that I love archaeology, but I missed the connection with people. Like, it's all about the past. So I knew that it wasn't right for me. And it was really hard. It's one of those moments in life where you have to suddenly come to a whole new identity of who you are, mid-20s. And it was hard, I'm not going to lie. And to quit something, it was the first time I'd ever quit something. But I knew I had to, because it wasn't the right direction. So I did, and I came back, and then I needed a job. So I ended up actually working in Hamilton at Dundurn National Historic Site, doing interpreter, and then I went into museum support clerk and doing things there. In museum work, it's very much associated with education,
right?
Be it we running programs or the general public. So doing that. In the meantime, while I'm doing that, my parents bought a travel agency. So I just, this is my life. And so okay. So I decided to do my diploma in travel and tourism from an international correspondence school, actually. So I did my travel and tourism diploma. And so I worked with them and I was working with Dundurn. Loved it, but it was getting a little much. So I decided to work full time with my parents and build up that business. So I did that. And then I was hitting my 30s and again, another shift in life. And I'd done different things. I wanted to learn more about certain different kinds of medicine. So I went down to India and I took classes in Toronto. So I'm always doing different things. And then I ended up, someone said, have you ever considered teaching? And I think part of me rebelled because everyone always assumes if you're studying humanities or anything like that, then that's your only option. And it really isn't. So I think that was always a bit of there's other things. But when I started looking at who I was as a person, and then what I'd done in museums and even how I approached in the business with the travel agency, it's all about connections and human. And so I thought, well, let's start investigating it. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to try it. And another very quick opportunity came up. So I went to Lakehead because I said, if I'm going to learn to be a teacher, I want to explore beyond Southern Ontario. I loved Thunder Bay, absolutely loved it. And it was such a great experience. I did my Bachelor of Ed there and found that, yeah, this works for me. I really enjoy this. And it's nice to give back, and it's that interaction, and it's knowledge and education, which I love. And so everything kind of came together, everything I'd done. So then I came back and I was on with Avon Maitland and Grand Erie, and then over time stayed with Grand Erie.
On both lists?
Yes, I was doing supply teaching. So this was 2009 when things were really much more difficult.
Yep.
So I was supplying for quite a while, and I've done elementary and secondary. And, I spent some time in elementary, then I'd flip to secondary. But secondary is, I think, a better fit for me. And then eventually, a couple of years ago, I was full-time with Grand Erie. So, yeah, it's pretty exciting. So who knows? I'm only 44, almost 45, so you never know what else might come up.
Well, I personally thought that one of the really interesting paths for a lot of the teachers who came back and did kind of came to teaching later, they came with a more fuller, richer life experience. Like nothing against the younger teachers at all, but it's some that, they come right out of school and they go right into teaching college and they come right into some teaching position. Or, you were a carpenter, you were a travel agent, you were like all these other things that in that classroom you can pull on this wealth of experience. I think it's it enriches the learning environment, I think.
I completely agree. I don't have the energy that I had in my 20s. So definitely younger teachers, their energy is phenomenal. And I so appreciate it because it really bolsters me. But coming back in my 30s, I feel that I've moved around a bit. Things have been tight financially, good financial, like a lot more fluctuations in life. And I think that adds a richness as well. And it's a lot easier playing mom when you're older to the high school kids than it is. I think if I think back to who I was at 22, I don't think I could have pulled it off like I can now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I can nag really well now. My mom taught me that too. So
how did you come about that you became the NDP candidate? So kind of out of the blue, all of a sudden it's... And Haldeman Norfolk now has an NDP candidate. So what happened there?
So I've been involved with I've always been a member for a couple of years, and I know Sabrina Sawyer, who's running in Brantford Brant, and I was helping her on her campaign, and I was really getting involved, and I'm very involved in my union. So it wasn't completely out of the blue in the sense of not being involved with politics and NDP, but more sideline, active participant through watching or reading, different things like that. And then honestly, the other thing was I was redundant this year, and it was my final sort of straw, and I became much more politically activated. And I think that helped inspire me this year to speak up more. So then was working with Sabrina, and we were just discussing it. And, I'm not from Haldeman or Norfolk, but I have so many connections to Grand Erie. Like I feel connected to this area. It's, I was at Caledonia Fair yesterday, and students come running over and so happy to see me. So I do feel connected to this community. That's part of that Grand Erie culture. So I said, you know what? I do care and I want to see this community succeed. There are so many potential opportunities in this community, and I think we need some change. And that's how it happened. And, I think sometimes we wait for someone else to step up. And I thought to myself, well, maybe it's time for me to step up. Maybe it's time to, instead of we all do this in life, well, we're waiting for someone else to do it. And I just sort of had a mental talk of, well, maybe you got to step up, Adrienne, and just do it. And so that's how it all happened. And I thought, let's go for it.
Would you like to talk about we can get into some of the policy pieces that you like? Is there one that in particular you really want? Like, I see you got lots of notes. This is where I can start to open up and you can kind of start to guide what you want to talk about.
Okay.
Because I know, so you're going to have, we can go anywhere. So I'll do a lead in there. So we can talk about, let's say, pharmacare. That's probably something.
That's a big one.
Okay, so the NDP talks. One of the policy pieces they've really been pushing in this last 4 years, or this upcoming election, is the idea of revamping the idea of pharmacare. Mm-hmm. Right. So, what are your feelings around the NDP policies there?
I am blown away with the leap that they've taken with this, and I think this has been a long time coming. Again, having traveled so much, other nations do this. When they say universal health care, it's universal health care. That means that it includes prescriptions. It may even include dental. It includes other services. And we haven't had that. And the intention has always been, when it was first delivered and proposed, was that it was supposed to include that. So when I look at, I love our system. I'm grateful for it, but it needs changing. It needs improvement. And it really breaks my heart. I was speaking with someone the other day. They earn their seniors and they earn $32,000 between them. And they have a $1,500 bill for dental, actually. They can't pay it. They're trying to make payment plan and work this out, which means then there's interest on it. That's not healthcare. And so when I look at universal pharmacare that the NDP wants to bring in, that was a big factor for me for wanting to be involved, because it's for everyone. And it's that universal. So this means that everyone now you'll be able to use your health card, your provincial health card, instead of putting your hand in your pocket or having to rely on credit cards. And I know, even looking at my own parents, they have a lot of medical conditions. Fortunately, they do have benefits, but not many people do. Especially when you're a senior, you often lose your benefits, even your benefits from a company. So this is all about affordability, making sure that people are well. And when people are well in their health, it creates a well society. It's an emphasis on wellness, not disease. Mm-hmm. And these are root causes as well. And it's also a way to tackle poverty. Again, when we look at poverty, people say, well, how are we going to help poverty? Well, we need to tackle the root causes. Being able to help people paying their bills with if you're diabetic and helping to pay with your needles and prescriptions, or if you have heart medication, that's a way to tackle poverty. And we have to start looking at those root causes. So when I look at the NDP policy on the healthcare and pharmacare, this is where we need to go. And I don't think any Canadian or anyone living in this country is going to deny that. It's fundamental for people's health. It's part of life. So definitely. And then the goal is also to include, the NDP is going to look into a strategy with including dental care as well. So again, these are high cost factors that are not obtainable right now for everyone in our society. And that's just not right, in my opinion, and nor in the NDP's. So yes, that's pharmacare.
One of the other big issues that keeps coming up, and it's an issue that's really a strong one, a need here in Haldimand, Norfolk, is the idea of affordable housing.
Yeah.
So where does the NDP kind of outline what they want to do for housing?
So definitely, this is a conversation we're hearing everywhere. I'll be honest, just last week, I I have a grade 12 class right now, and literally students are telling me they're afraid that they actually not even afraid. They feel hopeless, and they feel that they'll never own a home. These are 17 and 18-year-olds who are starting out in life feeling they already believe they'll never own a home. There's something wrong when 17 and 18-year-olds are feeling that hopeless. And even other people, I was speaking to someone yesterday at Harvest Fest. She was saying she has someone in Vancouver. She's worrying about they can't get a home. So this is something that we're seeing all across Canada. It's not just localized here. And then when we get into rural as well, the accessibility to housing is more difficult because of the rural nature sometimes. So one of the things that NDP has made as, again, part of affordability is their goal is to tackle the increased costs and rents, et cetera, by putting in affordable housing, 500,000 units over the next 10 years. And that is something that will hopefully help people who can't afford housing to be able to access a home. And on top of that, looking at ways to, okay, well, how do we deal with what's causing inflation to go up on our housing prices? So they're looking at the foreign buyers tax and implementing that for anyone who's not a permanent resident or a Canadian citizen who are buying property, because that's affecting our country as a whole. You know, some people might say, well, how does that affect us here in Halderman and Norfolk? Well, if they're buying prices high in Toronto, then people in Toronto need somewhere else to live. So, you know, then they're moving further out, which then drives prices here. So you see this trickle-down effect. So by trying to make sure that we deal with that issue of the impact of foreign buying and changing and inflating our housing market through a tax program, that is one way, again, that we're tackling the issue of housing. So it's not just a case of here's more units, it's also what's causing it. So I think that's something that is key to look at in our policy that we're offering that not everyone, well, no other party is.
Now, if I remember right, the NDP in the past, they really like to talk about education, like talk about, they often have had debt forgiveness inside of secondary learning, post-secondary learning. What's the NDP's idea there?
So what they're proposing, so they're committed to, yes, everyone should have the access to education, including in post-secondary. And so what the one thing that they want to do right off the bat is for on the federal portion of student loans. So if anyone's ever had a student loan, part of it is federal and part of it is provincial. So on the federal portion of a student loan, what they would do is you're still paying the loan back, but there's no interest. So it would be literally just paying back the loan. I can speak from personal experience. I've had loans. I still currently have one. It's quite a bit in interest. So it's for some people, they have to take the maximum option of 14 years. And so the principal that they're paying is very little at the very beginning. And so what it does is create already a set of inequality for those who've had to take out a loan and those who haven't. And this way, it's a way of trying to make that bar a little bit easier. So yeah, removing that interest on the federal portion and then trying to, and allowing more access through non-repayable Canada student loan grants so that students who need it can have that. And as we know, we've had a major shift in OSAP this year.
A little bit.
So
a little bit.
Yeah, just a slight change, which I can tell you right now, students are feeling it. And I'm hearing from my students, this is upsetting. They talk about this stuff. Students in our schools are discussing it. This is definitely on their mind. So again, trying to make sure that we're supporting our youth as well.
Another interesting topic that comes up, and it can be quite a sensitive one around here, is the idea of the interaction with First Nations. In our kind of world, it's more around the interactions we have with the Six Nations. Where does the NDP kind of stand on that type of relationship? Particularly what I am really interested in is truth and reconciliation, that whole, last CBC report that came out, 82% don't have clean
Water.
running water. There's a healthcare issue. There is an addiction issue. There's outcomes issues. And another one that I'm really keen on and is the relationship with the federal school system and the funding gap. So where's the NDP kind of stand on all, not all these issues, but, kind of lay out some of the platforms there?
Well, and I think the one thing the NDP has done that the other parties haven't is they've gone to Indigenous communities and said, we don't want to tell you what to do. We want you to tell us what you need and how we can help. So right off the bat, that's a totally different perspective. And there's an allyship or a respect. And so one of the things is, let's look at water. It is not right that just down the road from us, essentially, there are people who cannot access water. Water's life. You need water, period. And this is in our local backyard and across Canada. We're seeing this with the mercury poison. Water's life. So right off the bat, it's for the NDP, that's got to be addressed. And that is, they've been waiting. We have boil water advisories going on. So the NDP has committed to working with Indigenous communities to not only address this and end the boil advisories, but also for training and making sure that they're able to have that they have the education so they can be self-sufficient and work within their own community to maintain the health of their community through water. So it's not just here's some money, we're going to fix the problem. It's let's work with you. What do you need to make sure? And then how do we keep this going so that the infrastructure within your own community is capable of supporting and keeping you healthy? And I think that's a unique perspective that no other party is offering. And that's part of the whole process of truth and reconciliation. It's a very large document to get through. It's a very important one. We had the apology in 2008, but since then, there hasn't been enough change. So now we need to put this in action. So seeing that come to fruition through an NDP government, I think is something we definitely need. And I think they have the ability to communicate, and it's not a case of a patriarchal system, that fatherly, we're going to tell you what you need. Let's work together. And I think that is cutting edge after hundreds and hundreds of years of colonialism to finally deal with that. And there's trauma from all that. And so there's a lot of reparation and relationship building that needs to be done. And I think the NDP is the party to do it. I truly believe that.
I think, especially with Six Nation, there's an enormous amount of capability. If you look per capita on an Indigenous population, I believe they have the highest PhDs within their populations, right? It's a highly educated group, right? Very, very self-sufficient, very excellent at advocating. A couple of things that I find that are really frustrating is the system and how it works. So you look at education. You want to become a teacher there, you have to have a security clearance because the federal government requires a security clearance. You want to go through spending, you got to go through a federal spending, matrix. Those things I don't think are helpful. And when you talk about water, you talk the other pieces, again, because of the federal nature of the connection, I think that there's a lot of obstacles in the way that most people don't see. I think one of the things that any party really needs to do is get in there and understand that this is the complex nature and begin to break away from the old conversations, which kind of are, you need to take, ownership for yourself. And I think you really got to get into the idea of the people who know best for Six Nations are people from Six Nations
or Credit of the Mississauga.
And I love that. I love that talk because candidly, that talk's been missing for a long time.
Yeah. And we have a lot of relationship repair to do, and rightly so on our end.
What the Mohawk Institute literally sits just in the backyard.
Yes, it does. It was the model for a residential school system. And sadly he passed, but my friend was a kid who ran away from it, and the stories that he had, and even just from the community, everyone. And it's not just if you went to the residential school, the stories that you hear, it's what about the people left behind? And that changes a community. And then what people don't always understand from what my friends have told me is that that's trauma. and trauma carries down through generations. So we're responsible for that as a colonial historical nation. So we need to take our onus on that. And that's what from what I can read, and I mean, I'm a first generation Canadian, so I am a settler myself, but we have to take responsibility for that, and let's see what we can do together.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
this is a very, very agricultural riding. Yep. And I was really curious to know what the NDP thinks. What are some of the NDP agricultural platforms?
Agriculture is a thriving economy. And I don't think everyone, unless you live it, truly understands that. But it produces a large economy in our region because we do have it in both Haldimand and Norfolk. Interestingly enough, a small anecdote that in terms of education, students coming out of the Ontario Agricultural College, there are 4 jobs for every 1 graduate. So agriculture, and that I
didn't even know that.
Yeah, that is one of the things that they advertise. They come in and do presentations. There is economy and jobs in agriculture. So the one thing I love about the NDP when it comes to agriculture is they recognize that. And they're really wanting to invest in youth and women and people starting up farms. So one of the things they want to do for agriculture, one of their plans, is it's a whole government approach. And what they're looking at doing is lower interest loans for youth and women who want to get into farming. So right off the bat, because we all know starting farming, if you're someone who wants to start farming, it's very difficult. And there's a high risk with farming. We all know this. So that is right away, it's trying to capture that youth and make sure that they're staying in farming. And the other thing is there's a lot of, and I still have to investigate all the details, but there is some red tape to do with family tax transfers for family farms. Mm-hmm. So the NDP, one of the things they've decided to do is that for family farms to help support succession planning is to try and end this unfair tax treatment of family farm transfers. So again, that way kids who want to stay on the farm can stay on the farm. Mm-hmm. So we want to keep supporting that. But there's a huge economy in agriculture, and it blends into things like food sciences. And it's not just being on the farm. There's a whole wealth of connections to agriculture that by supporting that community, it can grow into a bigger economy. There are careers in agriculture, and I think we need to start, because we're such a rich agricultural community, and start speaking up and say, let's go. We can do this. We can offer something. And this also then, hopefully, you want to stop kids who want to stay on farms but have to leave. So you want to make it accessible that the family farm can survive and maintain, and that we support them. So that's something we definitely can do in this area.
So specifically in this riding, in the last election, when I was running, there was the issue of U.S. Steel and what was going to happen to all these pensions. Mm-hmm. It was a hot button issue. At the time, a lot of the parties were talking about what they were going to do. I was wondering if the NDP this time around has something to talk about pensions.
I think we've all seen in the news all over. We've had a problem with our pensions in terms of the defined pension plan for a while, and it needs to be addressed. And the NDP does have a platform on it. Right off the bat, what they want to make sure is that as part of their commitment is that companies cannot pay dividends to CEOs and chief financial officers when the pensions are underfunded, because that's been a big problem. And this is anyone who's reading Sears or, this isn't just a one time. This has been going on for a long time. They underfund the pensions, yet pay dividends. And then when you have a company go bankrupt, well, then their pension plan is underfunded. Well, these are workers who've put their entire 20, 30, I don't care if it's 5 years. This is the expectation. There's that sense of relationship and loyalty that's completely being broken. Mm-hmm. And it's wrong, period. So the NDP, one of the things, that's why they want to stop that. so that way any underfunded pensions, that has to be dealt with before dividends are paid out. They're also looking at making sure that for any bankruptcy situations, that any unfunded pension liabilities that are still owed to the employees, to make sure that their top up is prioritized.
So they queue up first.
Queue up first. Yeah. So I mean, imagine we've seen people, we know people this has happened to. Imagine putting 35, 40 years of your life in. You've worked hard. You're sore. You've been doing it since 10, 12-hour shifts some days. My dad worked at Ford. He's an electrician. And he would do 6 days a week, sometimes do overtime. He put his time in. And he literally had a heart attack at work. He put his time in. I can't imagine if he has a defined pension plan, if he was to lose that. And that's corporate greed outright. This is not a man, looking at my father, this is not a man who dreams of yachts or dreams of, having really expensive dinners. He wants to sit on his deck and enjoy his last years of his life.
Mm-hmm.
Pensions have to be the priority over dividends, period.
It's a big issue out here that when the U.S. Steel conversations were going on.
Yeah. And around here, if I remember correctly, and I'll have to double check, 20% of the population is 65 and over.
Sounds about right.
So, yeah, we have to look after our elderly. That's just respectful, period. You wouldn't kick your grandma. And that's kind of what they're doing.
I kicked my mom. I hope my mom's listening. All right. So one of the criticisms that always happens is, how are you going to pay for all this stuff? So I got to ask, in fairness, so how does the NDP plan to pay for their platform?
Yeah, that is completely, I was raised by my parents. That's a good frugal question, and I completely understand it. Right off the bat, we need to change the way we look at wealth in this and make sure it's more equitable. So one thing that they are committed to is a 1% wealth tax. And this wealth tax would be for people over 20 million a year. So this isn't going to be for you and me. This is for very high income. Oh, wow. But it's a 1% tax on earners $20 million or over. So that's another way to earn the income back and put the money back in the coffers so that we can pay for pharmacare, so that we can pay to make sure that instead of on the backs of students, we're putting it on those who are the most affluent in our society. It also looking at rolling back the corporate income tax that were made. They were cut by 3%. So looking at rolling back those tax cuts, because we have had lower corporate taxes, and that trickle down effect doesn't work. When you give we've seen it, we live it. When you give corporation tax cuts, you end up higher dividends for the board members. It doesn't mean they're going to generally, maybe there's some who's not, but generally it doesn't usually go into the pockets of the workers. So by 3%, so those points going back up, that then increases our revenue. So the idea is that we can balance. And I have to look up more details, but recently this year, there's an NDP minority government in BC. They posted a surplus. And they increased childcare and a number of things and still posted a surplus. So we have to start saying, again, everyone's saying, well, how's it going to cost? How's it going to cost? We need to do things differently. What are our priorities? I think for most people, their priority is, I want to be healthy. I want to have a home over my head. I want to have water.
Yep.
And I want my kids to have a future.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the priority for most of us and why we work. That's why we do what we do. We want to see all these things. So when you look at what we're spending on, this isn't frivolous spending. This is for the health of our society as a whole. And
that was the interview. As I mentioned, we're going to retool the show, so stay tuned next week. I'm just finishing off this next episode, and I hope you like it. Talk to you then.